with the Secular Dharma Foundation. Just catching up with my old friend Brian Dean Williams. How you doing, Brian?
I'm great. Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm stoked to hang out and talk.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. I'm using my Secular Dharma Foundation podcast as an excuse to catch up with old friends, and
Yeah.
also as a way to just sort of like ask you a bunch of questions because that's the nature of the interview. It's really, I think,
Yeah.
more of a dialogue. But we know that you wear many hats. I want to kind of see if we can get through most of them. I met you in a Dharma teacher training 15 years ago, and I
Yeah.
know at that time you were doing some Gestalt training therapy, and you kind of straddle these worlds: mindfulness, some Dharma stuff, psychotherapy, trauma, addiction, all the good
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so I just kind of want to start with just some background questions because most people who tune in are interested in Dharma Buddhist stuff more from a secular point of view, and probably more likely the integration of the two.
Right.
So, what is your Dharma background, Buddhist background, lineage, training, perspectives? Can you just walk us through how you think about that in your life and practice these days?
Yeah. Well, I mean, probably like yourself and like most of your listeners, I came to Dharma like kicking and screaming and through suffering enough that I finally like resorted to going to a meditation retreat. So basically, yeah, there was some really unfortunate life events that I went through in my 20s, and I was struggling with my mental health. I was struggling with addictions, and at a certain point, I said, screw it, and I put all my stuff in storage one summer and hit the road and decided to live outside for 3 months.
Mm.
If you can imagine, this is like a young punk rocker in the early 2000s. That's what was going on. So. Yeah, I was sleeping at the side of the road up here in Canada. I'm in British Columbia. And I impulsively, like sometimes impulsivity is cool. It takes us to interesting places. So I just impulsively signed
Yeah.
up for a Goenka Vipassana retreat, 10-day
Okay.
Vipassana retreat. I was the only Gen X person in there. It was mostly boomers, and I felt really out of place. It felt uncomfortable, and I had a really profound experience. I had like a really profound transformative experience. I personally don't recommend those retreats to people,
Yeah.
but I'm really glad that I went at the same time.
A lot of things are
And
like that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so that was definitely a fork in the road. Things started changing, and then yeah, and then I'm a bit of an ambitious person. I can be a little bit A-type, and so that tradition, maybe in a good way, maybe in a not so good way, really fed into my perfectionism, I think you could say. At the end of
Yeah.
those retreats, they say you have to sit an hour in the morning, hour at night. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it. And I was stoked, and I would sit an hour in the morning, an hour at night, and then eventually I missed a sit here, missed a sit there, and then unconsciously, I think at a certain point, I said, screw it, and just kind of my practice fell off.
Yeah. And
And
where
so
did you
then,
migrate next from the Goenka? Because Goenka
then,
is like where it all
then,
began, but not a lot of people have said those.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And then, yeah, and then, but also I'd studied a little bit of Buddhism in the like before all of this, so I knew some of the theory. I'd read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse,
Sure.
and took, took a religious studies course in university, and I think of all of them, Buddhism was like, huh, this one is more resonant than some of the others that I'm reading about and learning about. So yeah, then Noah's book came out, Dharma Punks came out,
Okay.
and I connected with that. I connected with Noah's story, and then with his encouragement, I co-created a peer-based group in Vancouver called DIY Dharma.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, which was kind of like this cool, it was in East Vancouver, which is sort of like Haight-Ashbury of Vancouver, so very progressive, punk rock, activist-y sort of, you know, inclusive space, very diverse folks coming to the sits, and I didn't really want to be a leader of it because I came from an anarchist background, and
Right.
yeah, so it was sort of like that, and then I did the training program with UNLA at Against the Stream, and then I started as part of that program. I started based on my own experiences of burnout and discouragement and disillusionment from doing frontline service work. That was part of the reason why I was struggling was because I was working with homeless youth in downtown
Yeah.
Vancouver, and it was really hard, and I was struggling with my own mental health and addictions kind of privately.
Hmm.
And that's how I went on that first Goenka retreat. So based on those experiences, I started a group in the downtown east side, which is sort of like the tenderloin of
Sure.
Vancouver, a kind of a tough neighborhood where there's a lot of suffering, a lot of addiction. And I started a sitting group for other frontline service workers, thinking that they might benefit from meditation too. So the first week, it was just me, this big empty space, just meditating like a freak by myself, you know. And then one other person came, and then two people came, four, and then soon we had this group of about 30 people of social workers, doctors, and so that became my jam. You know, I got my master's degree in psychotherapy. I started independent practice after doing many, you know, doing a couple of decades of frontline service work and youth work with mental health and addictions, and started my independent practice. And so a big part of that became sharing mindfulness, and I'd say often with a with a Buddhist twist to it, not just straight up kind of Western clinical mindfulness, but
Hmm.
I'd kind of integrate in some Buddhist ideas sometimes. So I started doing that with frontline service workers, with people who are working around folks who are unhoused or around addictions, and then I ended up doing training programs with prisons up here with prison staff, both clinical staff and guards. Um, yeah, and then I have done a lot of work in the last 5 years with Indigenous folks. So I was until very recently, for the last 5 years, I was flying in by float plane to a remote Indigenous community
Wow.
up here. They're known as First Nations folks, and they're struggling with the aftermath of colonization and
Sure.
genocide that's happened in this part of the world.
Yeah.
A lot of people in America probably think of Canada as this haven of progressiveness, but
We sort of
we
do,
have
and
our own
it's yeah,
dark
not true.
yeah, we have our own dark history with Indigenous folks, especially.
Yeah.
And so I was going in there doing counseling with folks, and as a way of taking care of myself, obviously my practice was a big part of that. Um, and and I also shared some meditation practices with folks, and even some Buddhist ideas sometimes where it was appropriate with folks who were interested in that or who felt connected with that. And interestingly, there was often a real resonance or synchronicity with traditional indigenous ideas. Like they didn't really oppose each other in a
Right.
lot of
Well,
ways. And
people forget.
I found that to be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha was an indigenous person of color.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
He didn't live in a palace, it turns out. He was,
Yeah.
on the land. Um, I want to go back and comb through a lot of what you just said, but I just want to just
Yeah,
put
that was a
in.
lot.
No, that's good. That's good. I
Yeah.
wanted to go there, and we go there whenever we want. But I also just want to get a sense of, because I remember when I met you, we were both doing the training, facilitator training, and I believe you were either knee deep into or getting into some of your training around psychotherapy, therapeutic work.
Hmm.
And I remember you doing a couple exercises around Gestalt. I don't know how much of that you still do, but I remember that was your kind of the flavor of your practice was the integration of those two. Will you just say a little bit about your sort of therapeutic background, training
Yeah.
approach?
Yeah, so now I'm a clinical supervisor as well. So I supervise and train master students in psychotherapy, and I have students and associates who work with me as part of my practice. And I work with a lot of people from the Buddhist community, actually. A lot of people from the Buddhist community come to me, and I integrate a lot of whatever, sometimes I call it secular Buddhist psychology into the work that we do. I'll talk about how the Noble Eightfold Path applies to their situation, or I'll talk
Yeah.
about the Four Noble Truths if they're suffering, or, I'll tell um, Angulimala stories about drawing boundaries or anger, so things
Mhm.
like that. People seem to really enjoy that.
Yeah.
So, and I tend not to do it in a way that's proselytizing. Um, but yeah, so sometimes I think about my practice as this is oversimplifying it, but it's an amalgam of actually narrative therapy and Buddhist psychology or Buddhist
Interesting.
practice, secular Buddhist practice. So narrative therapy, I don't know if you're familiar, but it's a third wave therapy that is it's a collaborative form of therapy. And the core idea is that we live our lives through stories.
We
We've been
do.
told stories about ourselves from the
Yep.
culture, from our families of origin. With enough repetition, we start telling ourselves these stories about ourselves, and they can calcify into an identity. This
Sure.
might sound kind of familiar from a Buddhist
Yeah,
perspective.
right. That's how that
So
works.
they
Yeah.
kind of, and then we start living through that story, and that story has real impacts on our lives, right? Um, so a lot of my work with people is in narrative therapy, it's mostly inquiry based. So what I'm trained in is asking really good questions with
Right.
people that kind of call into question the story that they're living through. So we're basically dismantling unhelpful guiding stories that they have about themselves and then working together to reconstruct or rebuild a preferred sense of identity or direction of where they want to go. Um, and I find that really helpful because it's collaborative. It really centers the person as the expert in their own life rather than me telling them what to do. And so, as you can probably imagine, Dave, this really integrates really well with secular Buddhist ideas.
Well, it does because I
And the
mean,
two practices, they really intermingle in a beautiful way sometimes in my practice. And I love it. I love the way that those two traditions complement each other, even though they don't really have a shared history in a lot of ways, but they've reached a lot of the same conclusions. So yeah.
yeah, I think there's a tension in that that I find, and I think this is where Buddhism can become problematic, is the whole self, not self thing.
Hmm.
Because especially if you have a nihilistic tendency, if you're kind of like don't
Right.
want to be here anyway, the idea that there's a not thing is like
Right.
really helpful and destructive at the same time. But it
Be
sounds like with the
nihilistic.
narrative
Yeah.
therapy, I mean, the self really is just a story or a series of stories.
It's constructed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
constructed over time. And a lot of times we live into these enacted truth claims that we think about ourselves in the world that are probably highly inaccurate, super
Exactly.
unhelpful. And I would
Yeah.
imagine people are, do you find resistance engaging in these stories? Or are people generally pretty eager to, it seems like it's a nice way to get into maybe some difficult material without people being suspicious
Yeah.
or
I
charged.
mean, the beautiful thing is that it's collaborative and it's invitational and it's so in that sense it's very trauma informed. So we're not pushing people over the deep end into trauma or forcing them to do anything really. So it's all invitational and collaborative, which is part of that really fits with my values and the ethics that I try to carry in my life and in the world. So yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of us, stories are very powerful, but they're not necessarily true.
Right.
Or as there's this great talk by Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, the Nigerian novelist, and she says in her talk, it's called "The Danger of the Single Story." It's a great
Uh-huh.
talk, and she one of the things that she says is the danger of stereotypes is not that they're true, it's that they're incomplete.
Yeah.
And so there's always multiple stories, multiple selves that we're working with, but usually it's often the problem story that's loud and it's getting a lot of attention.
Yeah. See, I would imagine from a Gestalt model is the idea, of course, is the whole is greater or different than the sum of its parts. And
Right,
so what
right,
you
yeah,
really want is the whole story rather than a
right,
bunch of like unfinished chapters that don't have
yeah,
they don't have a coherent narrative
yeah,
and they kind of go into these looping branches when the stories all start and they don't really end. And so,
yeah.
is part of that trying to craft an overall? I know the single story is kind of maybe dangerous, as you just said, but on some degree, I would imagine a coherent narrative is probably a good model to work for.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean this aligns a lot with my understanding of recent findings in neuroscience, which is that our memory is not fixed. It's not like a hard drive on a computer.
Right.
Every time we tell a story, it's restored as the upgraded version,
Huh.
as the new version.
Yeah.
And so, and that's it's kind of trippy, but and disturbing in a way, but also powerful that we can actually reshape our stories. And yeah, and so we can come up with more coherent or integrated stories that are more uplifting, more helpful, more in service of oneself and of the world.
Well, the thing I like
Yeah.
about what you're saying is also there's a couple things I would tie it to that are very Buddhist in nature. And I would say, like we talk about right speech, which always has such a terrible tone to it. Like this is the correct
Yeah.
way to talk.
Correct
But but
speech. Yeah.
but really thinking about it as voice. So it sounds
Yeah.
like in that you're practicing. So it sounds like it's a practice,
Yeah.
talking, dialoguing, telling stories, reframing the stories, inquiring about the stories. I would
Yeah.
imagine it's a great way to, there doesn't seem like there's an intended goal, but there's a practice between
Yeah.
the therapist and the client of just working through material in a way, recrafting it, reorganizing it,
Yeah.
restructuring it. It sounds very practice oriented rather than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And there's this one idea or practice in narrative that I find really helpful, which is called externalization, where you purposely place the problem outside of the person, or you talk about a problem like substance use, for instance, or alcohol. You talk about it as if it's a roommate that like an unwelcome roommate who's like
Hmm.
overstayed their welcome,
Yeah,
for
yeah, right.
instance, right? And
Yeah,
so you
yeah,
ask
yeah.
people questions like, does alcohol ever convince you to do things that aren't aligned with your values, for instance, right? Or how did alcohol trick you into getting drunk this time? What kind of tricks did it play on you? And so something that's really occurred to me over the years with my mostly secular perspective on Buddhism is that Mara, right? Like Mara to me is like is not necessarily a metaphysical being. Maybe it is for some people in certain, like in the traditional context or in certain current cultural contexts, but in the way that Buddhism for me through the prism of my Western conditioning,
Yeah,
I think of Mara as like a quality of the mind, right?
sure.
As that part of ourselves that is always trying to trick us or
Yeah.
that's always that's self-sabotaging us, right? So
Hmm.
for me, Mara is like such a great example of externalization. Like Mara was like that part of the Buddha under the tree that was trying to sabotage him from waking up. So
Yeah,
those two ideas
yeah,
to me
yeah. I
really
love that.
each other too. And I talk to clients about that sometimes.
I
Like
mean, if
what,
you think
how did
about it,
Mara, so sometimes I'll say like, how did alcohol convince you? But sometimes they'll say like, what was Mara telling you when you were feeling insecure at the party and getting anxious? Like what was Mara trying to tell you about yourself? Like I'll ask those kind of questions to Buddhist folks, for instance, right? So
yeah,
yeah.
in the culture, Mara is just the manifestation of the mental health crisis.
Right,
You
right.
know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he's doing pretty good. You know, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I was talking
Thriving.
to Jessica Mori. I interviewed her a couple months ago. You
Oh,
might
great. Yeah,
remember, and
I worked with her with the I am
I be me, yeah, yeah, yeah.
IBM,
And
yeah, back in the
she
day.
had a really interesting story about basically saying that under the tree, the Buddha was like going through all these past lives and all this. She goes, I think he was just doing trauma therapy for himself.
Wow,
He was
yeah.
just like coming to terms with what we would call an emotional intelligence, sort of the destructive side of the mind.
Yeah.
Whether they're psychological
Hmm.
narratives or behaviors, that there's this that
Yeah.
the equipment is the same. The equipment, the five aggregates, whatever you want to call it, can manifest destructive maladaptive tendencies,
Yeah.
or it can manifest wholesome constructive tendencies, but the
Right.
equipment remains the same.
Hmm.
So it's a matter of how we can not see ourselves as broken or bad or wrong, but realizing, okay, like I'm just not playing the instrument very well.
Yeah, yeah, nice one. Nice
Yeah.
one. Uh-huh.
Let's talk a little bit about. There's some themes, I think, some through lines with you that I think are interesting. If you want to talk about
Hmm.
some personal stuff, I think it would be
Sure.
helpful to a
Yeah.
lot of people occupy that space. So, trauma, addiction. My trauma therapist told me that if you
Yeah.
work at a paint store, you get paint on your clothes every day. And it
Right.
sounds like you've spent a lot of time working in the paint store.
Yeah.
Being in really just being around probably at times too much suffering, picking up that kind of secondhand traumatic experiences, and then also helping. Sounds like you helped a lot of people navigate burnout, uh, stress.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of your work has been in that area. Sounds like you went through it. Sounds like you got some paint on your clothes and then taught other people how to like not do that. Could you
Yeah, and
just
then
talk
got some
about
more
that a little
paint
bit?
on my
Because I think
clothes
that's
and
the burnout and stuff that people go through. What is kind of your experience with that, and maybe some ways in which people can make sure that they don't fall prey to that? Because that seems to be very common.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's so to me so noble and adorable that people want to help. I think I love that. That people just feel that they feel that call, right? They feel that
Yeah.
compassion, that call to action. And then unfortunately, some of us unconsciously kind of stumble into it without a plan or awareness about the impacts that it's going to have on us. So yeah, I mean, I've worked with a lot of organizations. I've also worked with a lot of first responders and frontline service workers in therapy and like seen firsthand some of the negative impacts that it can have on people, and also the paradox that it's also can be very extremely meaningful and uplifting doing that kind of work, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so in terms of how to not let it wreck you, I've been working at that for, 23 years now, and I don't know is my main answer. But maybe I do. But part of me thinks I don't know, and I'm still figuring it out. I still have bad days too,
Yeah.
where I feel like stuff is still sticking to me. But meditation has definitely been a big part of it. Movement has been a big part of it. Fitness has been a really huge part of me discharging some of what I'm holding in my body. So I,
Yeah.
I like to lift heavy. I was telling you before we started recording, I'm very stereotypical Canadian. I play hockey a few times a week.
Nice.
I go mountain biking. But I think connection is really important. And I've moved away from, early in my work, like many of us, I was talking about self-care, and I'm moving more towards talking about collective care, ways that we can care
Uh,
for each other. And
because
and
self-care actually
that's
sort of doesn't make sense. It's too isolatory. It's too
yeah,
like, how do you care for yourself in isolation?
yeah.
Maybe that's not such a good idea.
Exactly. So I think there's this interesting thing. I mean, man, this is like maybe a whole other podcast episode, but I've been working a lot with men. Like recently, I've been a little bit more focused on working with men around their wellness, with the intention that doing so hopefully helps the women and children and other folks in their lives. But I think my sense is part of what's going on in male culture right now, especially social media culture, besides all the super toxic stuff, like something that I'm seeing is in men's wellness culture, we're getting this message that if you just stack up enough wellness practices, then you're going to be okay. So if some of us listen to like Andrew Huberman, for instance, right? Awesome
Sure.
neuroscientist from Stanford. Great, has a lot of wisdom to share about wellness practices. But if I was to do everything that Huberman and others suggest, then I'd be like waking up at 5:30 a.m., lifting heavy, getting cold exposure, getting like low level
Yeah, you'd
light
be a
in my
Navy
eyes.
SEAL,
Like
man.
I wouldn't have time to like make a living or do anything,
Yeah.
right? And so I feel like a lot of us men and women too, but I have experience living in a male body. I just feel like I have definitely, I think, fallen into the trap of stacking up a quantity of wellness practices that I'm doing individually in an effort to be well. But what's missing is self-compassion or love. It's like
Oh,
we're putting
yeah.
all this like pressure on ourselves to like perform or to meet some kind of invisible standard that we're not really sure who set the standard, but we're trying to meet this standard and stack up, have the right diet, the right amount of exercise, light exposure, all the things, right? None of those things are bad things, but it's like in terms
Well,
of
they're
right intention.
excessive.
Exactly, yeah, and it's like it's possessive. There's grasping in that, right? And so I think that's a trap that I think is easy to fall into for frontline service workers is like trying to
Mm.
stack up a bunch of wellness practices. And what's missing, I think, sometimes is that right intention or sama intention of why am I doing this? Like,
Right.
am I trying to impress people on social media? Am I trying to avoid something about myself? Like just really, I think it's really helpful to check in around your intention and also to have the motivation be self-compassion and and compassion for others too, because yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like
I know
by
exactly what you're
yeah,
saying. I can say a
yeah,
lot about that. I mean, I struggle with this myself.
yeah,
And I think what it is there's some things baked into that that are important to interrogate. One of them is like any sense of being unwell is bad and wrong and it's a problem. And I
right, yeah,
basically need to buy all these like fitness, wellness insurance policies
yeah,
against, and it's also to pull yourself up by your bootstraps through the lens of
yeah.
science,
Hmm.
and
It's very
it's
like
got,
acquisitional, right?
yeah, it's kind of a product model, right? It's like you do
Yeah,
these products, you get the cold plunge, you do the eating at certain times, and it's like,
yeah,
it's kind of an anti-Buddhist thing. Because first of all, it's not very middle, it's very excessive.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's
yeah,
also like it doesn't sound like there's a lot of permission to be vulnerable or permission to be like, yeah, sometimes I'm just not okay.
yeah. It's
So,
kind of like that teacher that the Buddha found when he left the compound. Hey, that was like about punishing the body to release the soul. I forget
yeah,
the name of that
exactly. Yeah,
teacher,
yeah,
but
that's
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
So it's just there's not a lot of room for, well, what do you do with difficult emotions?
yeah,
What if you what do what do you do with suffering? It's like, well, you're not, you just out exercise it, right?
yeah.
This word they use, which I can't stand this word, is optimize.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
know, yeah,
yeah.
and so I think that's what they call bro
Problematic.
science. I wouldn't call Huberman bro science because I think he actually knows what he's talking about. But
Yeah,
there is this kind of arena of that, which I think is very trapping for a lot of people.
yeah. And it sets an unreasonable standard, and then people are kind of suffering in silence with shame if they're not able to meet these unreasonable standards that are set,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's very real. That's very real for a
So
lot of people. Know who's good in this conversation if you come across him? I don't like a lot of what he says, but his interest in young men and their struggle, I think, is really sweet. Is Scott
yeah,
Galloway.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've been
Yeah.
checking out Scott Galloway lately too.
Yeah, because he talks about this other thing. There's another guy up your way. Have you come across John Vervaeke yet?
No, I don't think
You
so.
should check out. He has a whole series of lectures called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Oh, okay. Huh.
And we could talk about this a little bit because I think it plays into the trauma and addiction thing very well,
Hmm.
especially the addiction thing, is that younger people, I'm sure you worked with youth for a long time, as did I, is
Yeah,
people are undergoing this radical sense of things not being meaningful, like not having a sense of
yeah,
meaning or
right.
purpose, which again, you're not going to cold bath your way out of that one, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And I think that in many ways, the addiction and especially the mental health crisis is
yeah,
fueled by this emotional engine, which is
yeah.
just kind of sense of nihilistic, you know,
Hmm.
nothing meaningful for me in my life.
Yeah,
You must
yeah.
come across that in your work.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I draw a lot on existentialism and Viktor
Yeah,
Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, right? I love that idea that, and this is pretty Buddhist idea too, that like life has no inherent meaning except that which you create, right? And I think for me, a lot of that meaning is created in relationships. So I guess coming back full circle, like instead of self-care, if we're doing more collective care and more focused on sangha, or creating meaning in community with other people in relationships. I think that's where it's at. Like my understanding is that a lot of that stereotype of the monk meditating in a cave with an eagle flying over top somewhere in Asia
yeah,
wasn't really what was happening. People were practicing together in community, right?
yeah,
And so, yeah, it's interesting because 10 years ago, probably, when we last talked in depth, I was super into running ultras and doing obstacle course races and stuff and spending a lot of time by myself alone in nature running, trying to get somewhere. I don't really know where I was trying to get in retrospect, just to wellness or something. But
yeah,
I don't necessarily regret it. I had a lot of amazing experiences,
sure,
but it's just interesting now because now my fitness is more about community. Like I play hockey and I see the people in my community and I'm like, hey, how's it going? And I have these relationships with people based on some of the fitness stuff that I do. So I just find that it's just kind of interesting how our perspectives on these things can change. Because I was like all about running, like even 5 years ago, it was like my thing or like part of my identity. And then now it's kind of not really a thing for me. So
Well, it's also
yeah.
the screen that's to blame for some of this, is that we've become so isolated, and I think that
Yeah.
there's um, and that plays into which the Buddhist monk in the cave is just a 2,000-year-old version of the Huberman thing. It's just like, it's
Yeah.
just what they were
Yeah. Yeah.
doing, and
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that what people really find is they don't feel like they have somebody that they can talk to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then and I think it's great what you're doing. I've worked as a kind of a clinical therapist from in some capacities, and I've also
Yeah.
worked with a lot of therapists. Um,
Right.
but we have to pay money to go have meaningful conversations with
Yeah.
a mental health professional,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
like learning how to do it with the person who's sitting next to you on the hockey bench or
Exactly.
whatever the case is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I learned so much. Like I have so much gratitude that I got to work and be embedded in an indigenous community, and that is still quite connected with some traditional practices. And so one practice that they have here on the West Coast with indigenous folks, probably like down into the current day US too, is the potlatch. And the potlatch is when everybody gathers in this giant that's called a big house or like a long house. There's a fire in the middle, and it's this massive giveaway. So somebody will be like taking on a name or an identity that they've inherited, and they need to be witnessed by the community in order for it to be legitimate. And in this society, you get status not by acquiring things, but actually by giving things away.
Mm.
So so
See,
there's
we
like
don't
this
have no
massive
version of that.
it's just
And
like so anti, like it's so like countercultural to what I grew up with of like individual acquisition, right? This is more about like collective generosity. Not to
yeah.
romanticize it. There's also like any community, there's problems. But I love I just I have so much appreciation and love for being around that for 5 years. Just and people were just constantly giving away fish. Like when we'd go out, it's a very boat-based culture and fishing-based culture. And so I'd go out on the land fishing with guys. Apologies, vegans. But it's, part of the culture. We'd be out there
Yeah,
on the
for
land
sure.
fishing. And then when we
Yeah.
came back, nobody kept the fish. All the fish went to the elders in the community. Like we'd go around on ATVs and like deliver fish to elders because that was just part of the culture, right? So yeah, so in terms of sustaining ourselves in this work, like yeah, just trying to really avoid isolation, trying to avoid just going too deep into individual experience and keeping it more collective, staying connected, creating meaning through relationships.
Well, one of the
Yeah.
criticisms that I get and that I hear, a lot of people actually don't like this word secularity or secular, which you've used
Right.
quite a few times, which I
Yeah,
appreciate,
yeah.
is because one of the arguments is that, and I think there's some truth to it, but I think it's not a fully understood concept, is that a lot of these things we talk about, these community building things, these connection with people, a lot of these practices, they come from ancient traditions, even if it's just
Right.
going to church, like
Yeah.
that is falling away. But it doesn't seem or appear that secular society has a modern version of that.
Right.
Like, where do you go civically? Where do you go and where do you find that without having to go to an indigenous culture or going
Yeah.
to antiquity to kind of find this stuff? It seems like that's
Yeah.
a big hole that needs to be filled.
Well, something that, I have something interesting to say about that I didn't think I was going to talk about this today, but I grew up in like in a Christian community. In my 20s, I went to way the other direction towards like atheism, anarchism, punk rock, all that stuff.
Everything that
Like
was
many
not
of us,
that.
like many of us have, right?
Yeah.
Um, and but I realized recently, and I have some, we could talk about this because I've actually kind of gotten a little more interested recently in the devotional aspects of Buddhism.
Hmm.
Because I went to Thailand recently and I was like, I kind of like woke up that part of me again. So we could talk about that in a bit if you want to. But what I was gonna say is that I realized how much I miss singing with in groups
Mhm.
with people, right? And like I had that in church growing up. That's a really cool thing. It's like everybody singing together, and then some of the like singing in punk rock when we're all singing along, whoa, like we're all singing
Yeah.
together in the crowd, right? And that was maybe something about it. It's like we love to sing together. So recently in this, I live in a smaller community in British Columbia, north of Vancouver, and at Christmas, like we were singing like Christmas songs with our community. We projected it on the wall, and I was like, wow, I kind of like this. Like this is really fun, and it really lit something up in people in my community too. So after that, we've been meeting once a month with about like 10 to 15 of us, and we all bring instruments, and we are just singing like pop songs together and just singing together as a group, and people love it, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm like, wow, like there's something about like as we've become secular and we've let go of some of these religious institutions, we've really lost I feel like we've what's been lost, there's been, there's many upsides to it, of course, right? But I think we've really lost that sense of community sometimes, or places to gather in
Yeah,
community.
that's
So we have
right.
to kind of get creative about how to create those. And then, and we've also, I think, maybe lost a sense of like, I don't know even what to call it, but like mystery or awe, right? Or
Yeah.
like the divine or the sacred. And what can that be like without having to necessarily endorse religious institutions, right?
Well, that's a really interesting question because I mean,
Yeah,
nobody seems to have an answer.
right.
But a lot of people have pointed it out as a problem. Like if you look at Dacher Kelter's work at Greater Good Science Center, I think his recent book was called Awe and Wonder. And
Nice.
it's
Yeah.
trying to secularize, like some people hear the sacred or these things you just talked about, they're like, oh yeah, like
Yeah.
there's a way in modernity which we're trying to maybe separate ourselves from that, but we're paying a huge user's fee for that move.
Exactly. And a lot of it is probably religious trauma too. Like people
Yeah,
just have religious trauma, so they just want to like throw the baby out with the bathwater. But it was really interesting, Dave, like being in, I've been influenced a lot by secular Buddhism and Stephen Batchelor's writings were definitely like a game changer for me when I read Buddhism Beyond Beliefs back in the
yeah,
day, like early in my engagement with Buddhist ideas. I was like, oh, okay, I can handle like I can get with this.
right.
Um, so I really love a lot of those ideas and I've been operating on that. Like it says on my website, like secular Buddhist therapy or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I know. I
and
saw
so
that
I've been
earlier. I was looking at
really,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
so I've been, that it's been very helpful set of ideas for me and practices for me. And it was interesting and surprising for me recently when I went to Thailand with my family
Where'd you
and we
go?
got to it was amazing. It was like the best vacation we've ever
Where,
had.
where parts of Thailand did you go to?
So we were in Bangkok for 4 days, and then we went south. We went to this tiny little island called Koh Mook, which I highly recommend. Maybe I shouldn't even talk about it publicly because I don't want to wreck it. But it's this
Well,
it's
don't
this
worry, we don't
little
have that many listeners, so it's
yeah, yeah, okay, okay.
okay.
So it's this little island of 1,000 people. There's no
Wow,
cars. You get around by on Vespas and scooters and stuff. So
nice.
it was very quiet and more Muslim in that part of Thailand actually. And then we went a little bit north into the Gulf of Thailand to an island a lot of people know called Koh Phangan, which is where Buddhism, like Thai Buddhism, is a lot more prominent. And I was actually traveling with an old friend of mine who I met there 20 years ago, who's
Wow,
married to one of my wife's best friends.
nice.
So we have that connection. They live in Canada now, but we all traveled from Canada there together and met there. And when I first met him, he was a Buddhist monk. He'd just gotten out of the monastery. His hair was still growing in. And he was like really tripped out that I knew some stuff about Buddhism, like
Yeah,
this Farang or white guy. And I was like talking to him about these Buddhist stories, and he's like, who is this guy? And
yeah,
then so we've had that connection like for the last 20 years. His name's T. He's really awesome. He runs a Thai food truck in Nelson. If anybody's ever going through BC, you definitely got to hit up his food truck. Um, but I was there with him, and so he really, he has a Buddhist practice, like a Thai Buddhist practice, and so we practiced together some mornings, but we went and made offerings to the monks. Like one of the mornings, like we jumped on our scooters and went and made offerings to the monks, and I was like, oh my God, this is like such a beautiful
I know.
cultural practice, right? And and then we went to the temple for the I think it's called Tokbok, where we bought some supplies for the monks and we brought it to the monks and my kids were there. And then the monks invited us to come back the next day, and the abbot did this ceremony for us, like a blessing. He chanted in Pali and gave these bracelets to the kids and like tied it around, and they were just like they were in awe, like they were in wonder. My youngest kid was like he was just like so in it, and it was just so beautiful to see.
Yeah, see, we
And
don't have
I
any of
was
that.
like, I was like, wow, like this is I didn't know that I don't know exactly what spirituality is or devotion, but that that if it exists, that's it. Like I was like, wow.
Yeah.
They're like, I was like, this is
This
amazing.
is it.
Like this is generosity, this is wonder, this is beauty, this is like the seeing the commitment of the monks to their practice. It's
Well,
like,
really,
wow.
what it was deeply meaningful.
It was meaning. Exactly. We're back to meaning. Yeah. 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 It was
Yeah.
very meaningful. Yeah.
That's where I think of this too. Is like what would be because we because of mindfulness, which I mean I think the explosion of mindfulness is by and large just a wonderful thing, but
Yeah.
it kind of has attached itself to science,
Neuroscience,
neuroscience,
self-improvement,
the brain, all that
optimization.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, which is also beneficial, but what gets lost in that is what would, and this is for me a secular point of view, is what
Yeah.
does a middle way between science and religion look like?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
there is an appreciation for wonder, for the mystic,
Yeah.
for these ideas that we don't want to just leave those behind. It's like, what is religion without dogma? What is
Hmm.
science without its kind of analytics? Like
Yeah.
there is this territory of humanity that sits somewhere in there that I think has either been underexplored or not emphasized.
Yeah.
That's most interesting to me. I don't have a lot to say about it because I'm just
Yeah.
kind of like I always end up in this meaning thing because there's a philosophical dimension to it. Probably
Yeah.
there's probably a lot. It's like an intersection of 10 roads, and how
Yeah.
do we open to all of those and try to craft something for ourselves? And probably by and large, it's going to include other people. Um, you know, I've always been, for reasons we probably don't even need to get into, but like I haven't always felt welcome or safe or connected to Buddhist communities. And the ones that I had, that wasn't necessarily didn't turn out to be the best idea. But in the Buddhist tradition, there's tremendous emphasis on this idea of taking refuge, which is a
Yeah.
tremendous, I think, a very important realization that you can't do this alone.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Man, it's just an interesting time to be practicing. Um, yeah, it's just such an interest because of everything that's going on politically, everything that's going on culturally. Science has its own set of assumptions too, right? It has its
Yeah.
own like
It
kind
has
of
its own
unspoken
trappings just on
assumptions.
the other side of the,
Like everything's measurable or
yeah.
everything's observable. That's actually not true. Like when you start getting into quantum stuff, right? So it's like, yeah, so like I think it's interesting because I feel now like at 52, I'm much more in a place of not knowing. Like I feel like
Yeah.
I don't have things figured out. I'm just interested
Yeah.
and
Well,
curious. Yeah.
well, where this is all kind of landing, I think, where I wanted to start, we kind of end up there whenever we end up there, is like this is where I think a lot of people seem to sort this out in the therapy. This is where Western therapy maybe thrives.
Right. Yeah.
Especially, I always jokingly like to say, like, I have a lot of students, a lot of friends who are therapists, and how happy they are when they get a new client who actually already has a mindfulness practice.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
they're like, oh wow, we're
Yeah.
gonna get so much done.
Yeah.
But when there's a contemplative framing
Yeah.
integrated into, well, whether it's the narrative, it seems to be that's where people currently seem to get the most transformation actually happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Do you find that? Because I
Yeah.
know you probably sit one on one with a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I might get in trouble with the therapy world for this, but like if our culture was healthy and integrated, then therapy probably wouldn't exist.
Well, yeah, yeah,
You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
so
Well,
sometimes
your
I feel
job
like
is to become
I'm like the
unemployed.
paramedic on the battlefield, just
Yeah,
like
yeah,
picking up the pieces of capitalism and all the,
yeah,
and all
yeah,
this stuff that we've been through
yeah.
together
Yeah. I mean, the
culturally.
goal of your
So,
the goal of your job is to become unemployed. I mean,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And again, like not to romanticize Thailand, but it was interesting being in Thailand and being with the kids and being like, have you guys noticed there's not very much homelessness? And talking
right.
to Thai people about it, and they're like, why would you have a family member living outside on the streets? Like it's like it was like inconceivable to a lot of folks, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so to me, like, yeah, like the fact that therapy exists is a bit tragic in a certain way, but again, it's a both and thing, right? Of like it's also super inspiring to be part of it and to be invited to witness people's transformations. And I am I'm so blessed to be able to watch people overcome huge stories that they have about themselves, whether it's that they're an addict or that they're traumatized and they're always going to be like that or whatever. And to
Hmm.
see that people can actually make profound changes in their lives. They can transform their sense of meaning. They can transform their sense of identity. And so to be invited into that is that's a sacred space, actually. Like I think of therapy as being a sacred space that I get to go into with people. And yeah.
Well, that's where Buddhist ideas become very encouraging because it's like, well, nothing's fixed. Like
Yeah.
people a lot of times where, trauma starts to sound like a cancer diagnosis. Like it's, oh,
Yeah.
I've got the capital T trauma,
Right.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, that's not, I think a lot of times the way that we diagnose and label things is actually part of the problem. And that
It's a
when you,
self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
yeah, that there
Yeah.
you go. And that's part of the narrative you live out, right? Like, well, I have
Yeah,
trauma,
exactly.
therefore I have addiction, therefore
Yeah,
I'm screwed, therefore you can't
exactly.
help me.
Yeah, but we're all actually multi-storied, right? And
Yeah.
so some another idea in narrative that we work with is called unique outcomes, where um you're getting really curious with people about exceptions to the problem or times when they overcame the problem.
Mm.
And they'll often discount it, be like, have you ever if they're there to work on smoking, like a somewhat banal problem, right? Then a narrative question might be like, was there ever a period where you let go of tobacco? Yeah, it was 3 months. But and then people will quickly say, but it was nothing. And then I would just like start
It didn't
smoking.
count.
Like, wait a second. You
Yeah.
you quit for 3 months? Like, how did you pull that off? Like what? And then
Right.
you get really into that with them, right? Of looking at the unique outcome or a time when they weren't living by that dominant story. Yeah, and that's really inspiring to see. And yeah, and it's hopeful. And there is that Buddhist idea of impermanence that stories can change. And, and that idea of like there not being like a fixed or enduring self or soul that's driving the whole thing. It's
Well, the edgy
malleable.
thing is a
Yeah.
story can change on a dime in the moment and change the whole thing.
Yeah. I grew up, I often talk about this when I'm teaching narrative, but I grew up with this story that I was clumsy.
Yeah.
Right. So I was bigger than most. I had these two best friends in Toronto where I grew up, and I was bigger than them. So when we would like get into play fighting and horseplay, I would just accidentally kick their ass and hurt them. They'd be like, "Ah, Brian, like why are you so clumsy? Like you hurt me, right?" And playing street hockey, I'd hurt
Sure.
them, and so there was this repetition of like, "Oh, Brian, you're clumsy." One of my friends, Richard, had was like we are all into Star Wars because we're Gen X kids,
Of
and
course.
he was a single kid, so he got all the Star Wars toys, like the brand new Star Wars toys. I'd come over with my little Luke Skywalker action figure, and he'd be like, "Oh, that's cool. I got the Death Star and the X-wing and my Falcon." And I'd be like, "Oh, cool." And I think once I dropped his brand new X-wing and broke the wing, then it's like, "Oh, Brian, you're so
Clumsy.
clumsy, right?" And so you start getting all these plot points, right? These life events, and then you start connecting these life events and making meaning from it and being like, "Oh, I guess I'm a clumsy kid." And then guess what happens when you think you're a clumsy kid? You start acting clumsy, right?
Yeah,
You
right.
start knocking stuff. Hey, I'm a clumsy kid, and you start just like knocking stuff over, right? And
Yeah.
that was going on for me. And and then it wasn't until I was about maybe 24, 25, I moved to the West Coast and I was driving through Vancouver, and it was almost like a sunbeam came through the windshield of my car. I was like, ah, wait, I'm not clumsy. Like none of my current friends would ever think of me as being clumsy. They might actually think of me as being gentle or
Right.
graceful. And I realized that whole story was a fabrication. I'm just using this isn't that's not a very consequential story
It is, but though, because it paints a
story, but
picture
it's
of
just to
like,
illustrate this
yeah.
idea that like these stories can be like that's how stories are created. They can be consequential. They can
Well, then the
become
question becomes how many of those
self-fulfilling.
are running?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, but the fun, and then I had a relapse on that story because one of those two best friends moved out to the West Coast. We all have families now and stuff. We were visiting with their families. And I started thinking, he's gonna think that I'm still clumsy. And then I like knocked over like the water at dinner. It's like, oh, look at I'm
God
back to the
damn it.
clumsy story. But then I just gave him the TED talk that I just gave you, and he thought it was interesting. So
That's great.
we broke it down. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in our couple of minutes here,
Yeah.
what are you looking forward to? What are you feeling hopeful about in the world right now? What do you, when you look out into the future, what are some things that you have in mind that you're doing, that you're seeing that evoke a sense of optimism or hopefulness or just a sense of like looking forward to do?
Yeah. Um, I yeah, that's such a great question. I just want to be with my family, man. Like I'm super into just being with my kids right now, with my dog, with my partner. I love being out in the woods. I really love working with men right now. I'm really inspired by men who are interested in changing the story of masculinity, right? And
Yeah,
like
definitely.
intentionally choosing how they want to show up as men in the world and to do that with integrity, right? And to change the story of what it is to be a man. So professionally, that's got me really fired up. Honestly, I'm
Is
not
there a big
doing,
appetite for that you find? I feel like
yeah,
I feel
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
starting to rise up a bit more.
I feel like that's a story that's not being told. Like we have these really big, um, like we have these big, loud, toxic in air quotes voices about how men are supposed to be, you know? Um, and then we have, on the other side, we have, everything's just so polarized right now. But I think what's not the story that's not being told is that there's a lot of guys like yourself and like many men that I know that are actually like showing up as partners in a radically different way than even one generation ago.
Totally.
You think about how a lot of us are parenting, like there's a lot of dudes that are reading books to their kids before they go to bed, that are like getting down on the floor and playing Lego with their kids, or like just being like interested in their kids, right? Like this is
Yeah.
like revolutionary kind of stuff for men, and I feel like it's really important for us to be accountable and to change some of the violent and unhelpful aspects of masculinity, but I feel like we have to balance that out with also celebrating and uplifting some of the amazing stuff that a lot of guys out there are actually doing.
Yeah.
Like you think about like how long dads were hitting their kids. Like, are we talking centuries or like millennium, But in
No, not that long ago.
one generation, we're like, yeah, we're not really doing that anymore. Like,
Yeah.
what the hell? That's crazy, right? Like we're not talking about that stuff. So I find like when you create like I do men's groups online.
Oh, nice.
I do individual work with men. I went to like a gathering of indigenous men up north here a few months ago, and I just yeah, right now professionally, that's really I'm really into that right now. I feel like that's part of my calling, and of course the whole intention behind that is that it also will serve the women and kids and non-binary and everybody else in these men's lives. It's
It
not
will
about
trickle down, hopefully.
yeah, exactly. That's the hope. And so in terms of Dharma, like I got to be honest with you, like I'm not teaching Dharma as much publicly now. I used to do retreats internationally. I did a retreat in Costa Rica and in Portugal with my colleague Melissa Appleton.
Mm.
And it was awesome. I loved it, but I can't with everything that's going on in the world around climate change and like, we've have huge fire risks here where I live. I just can't justify having a bunch of people fly with me from North America to these international places to go and practice. Like as
I
fun
hear
as it
you.
was, I just can't really
I'm with you on
do
that
it.
one.
And I feel like, and I also just feel like part of the path for many of us is disillusionment, right? And like I've been moving through a lot of like disillusionment with Buddhism and like disappointment in
You're preaching to the
teachers,
choir. I mean,
disappointment
that's why we're
in
here
yeah.
today.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I'm like, so I haven't been to the Gen X Dharma teachers gatherings in a few years
Me
just because I
neither.
feel like I'm just not really in that space right now.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't feel like when I'm in this space that I need to be teaching publicly. Like I'm still I'm in that kind of liminal space of figuring stuff out, and that's actually a really beautiful and sacred place to be. So
No, I'm happy
yeah,
to hear that. That's why I wanted to talk to you today because I feel similar that way. I don't really I try to I try to teach at places I can drive to, which is better than flying, but trying to do stuff that's
yeah,
just that again from that you mentioned his name earlier, a lot of the secularization of Dharma through the work of Stephen Batchelor and trying to give people practices, perspectives, ways that are actually relevant
yeah,
to their lives
practical, yeah,
and then
yeah,
transformative in a way that may or may not have Buddhist roots.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the what I find really interesting about Buddhist history is like how it's always
Always
and
changing.
filtered through the prism of culture, right?
Yeah,
Like you
totally.
think about like Theravada Buddhism, like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, that looks a certain way. Then when it moved over into like Vietnam, then you've got like Mahayana as it moves into Korea and Japan and China with Chan
And now it comes
and then
over here and it's like,
Tibetan, man,
yeah, yeah,
Tibetan with all
totally.
the deities and
I
everything,
know.
and now we've got Western Buddhism and it's intermingling with psychology and philosophy, and yeah,
Yeah.
it's just so like it's really interesting to be in this moment where this whatever we want to call it, this fourth wave of Buddhism is developing in the West, and there's a lot of lay people practicing, which you don't
Yeah.
see a lot traditionally,
No, you don't
right?
see. In
So
fact, I
yeah,
would even say we're in the pretty early stages of that.
it's like we're in the infancy of it,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Like
Yeah,
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 yeah, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Hey, well,
man,
it was
this was really
really,
fun. Thanks a lot.
yeah, yeah. No, no, it's great to see you. I will send you the stuff over when it's finished.